more, and now this is why we've reached the point where a lot of people believe that the white race, the white European Christian race, is being exterminated by, again, political forces using immigration as a way to basically destroy what? Rome, right? Rome.
Welcome back to RDT Radio. I'm Anthony. I'm here with my good friend Frank. We're going to be discussing Patriot Front this evening. Frank, I don't know if you've seen Patriot Front in the news. They are a secular organization. They broke away from Vanguard, kind of post-Charlottesville. Vanguard was neo-Nazi. Patriot Front is somewhat reformed now from what I'm hearing from just anecdotal talk, is that many of the men are Christian, but it is a secular organization primarily. We also had E. Michael Jones very harshly attacked by the neo-Nazi Thomas Sowell, not to be confused with Thomas Sowell. This gentleman is from Australia. He is a neo-Nazi, and we see this online constantly. These groups seem to be secular, and they're always attacking the church and Catholicism essentially as weak on these issues.
Thank you for having me back on, Anthony. Yeah, I just started following it a little bit, and it's fascinating because, the first thing you say to yourself, what is this group? Who are they? What are their roots? What are their motivations? And who are they behind the scenes kind of a thing? Are they feds? Are they a giant psyop? Are they white nationalists? I don't know. I can't speak to that, but what is interesting to me is that it's a trend that's kind of popping up all over the place. A couple of months ago over in Ireland, you had the Irish over there, young white men masking up as well too, cutting out videos about how they're going to take back Ireland. And you've had other movements, places like Italy. And so the point I think here is that without knowing who these people are, just taking it as, face value as I can take it for right now until there's more information, it seems to be, again, this, white people finally standing up for themselves, or at least that's what I like to believe. I could be completely wrong, but that's what it seems like right now. And it's kind of understandable in a way because, we're at a point in history where Europe and America have been invaded, and, immigration has become a problem. It's changing the demographics all over the place. And some concerns are rising in the West over this immigration issue. Now, in terms of E. Michael Jones, he's the one that a few months ago pointed out, this thing going on also in Ireland. His position back then was the same as it is now. If we start focusing on the race issue, if we make it about a black and white or black and brown or black and yellow issue, this is going to be a problem. The Irish are going to lose. The Irish were oppressed by the British for a very long time. The way they fought them and the way they earned their independence over there was through the faith. They consolidated through the Catholic faith, and that's what E. Michael Jones is laying out, that without God and without the faith, a lot of these movements are going to be futile. And a lot of these young men are going to wind up either being hurt, killed, or thrown in jail at some point. And that's my concern for these young men, because without the faith, I don't know how you establish any kind of order, especially simply based on racial identity. Now, I'm not saying race is not important, but I don't think it's the end all. I think I kind of take Pat Buchanan's position, who said that race isn't everything, but it's also not nothing. And so I understand in a pluralistic society why people are gravitating toward race, since we've all become this melting pot with different creeds and cultures and faiths and religion. And it's the one thing that unites a certain set of people that have been ostracized and attacked by the liberal society because of the color of their skin. And it's the one thing that unites this pluralistic culture society in the West, especially in America and places like Ireland. I get it. But at the same time, I think focusing just on race is going to be a mistake, because what is at essence here is a spiritual battle in the West, and a spiritual battle that has to be fought at that level, and not simply by identitarian politics, but a spiritual battle within the realm of the faith. It's not going to work without the faith. Myself as an integralist, I have my different political ideas, but I say it all the time, Anthony, that without the faith, all of this is futile.
Yeah, exactly. I don't place any judgment on Patriot Front itself because I don't want to rash judge them as a group. I know there's a lot of people that speculate they're feds or there's something else. I don't know. If they are legitimate, I would ask that they hear us out in terms of the reasons why, historically speaking, philosophically speaking, that remaining secular is a really bad idea because, as you point out, you've got to have a concrete foundation to build on. It's one thing to say that we're going to deport all these people. And even if you come to power and you accomplish that, it's something else to really understand how you can keep your society concrete, how you can keep it from being infiltrated, how you can stop these perpetual revolutions and large-scale wars that we're constantly being dragged into by these forces. So, by way of example, hear us out. For instance, Ukraine. Look at what has happened in Ukraine. You had a neo-Nazi group there in Ukraine that we all remember seeing at the beginning of the war, and they were like, no, there's not Nazis there. And it turns out that there were. And those early groups, when they first started forming prior to the war, they had all of the rhetoric and all the same symbolism. And the rhetoric was against Jews, right? Now, the rhetoric didn't seem to matter. That just seemed to be there to grow membership. And then eventually, Jews were let into that group. And that group fought for Zelensky, a Jew, and a Jewish oligarch that supports Zelensky in this war. Now, you can say that there's mitigating factors, but if you look here in the United States and you start looking at the neo-Nazi groups that are prevalent and you begin to research them, many times they go back to being connected to Satanism and also connected to the intel agencies, which, by the way, are also connected to who? Israel, the Jews, Mossad, IDF, etc. They're connected. So you have to ask yourself, you see these neo-Nazi kind of pagan-like white boys attacking Catholics and Christians constantly online. And it's always with the Jesus hate. And it's like, to me, that's the tell. The most Jewish thing in the world is to hate Jesus. Okay, they hate him. They openly admit it. We've seen that over and over and over again. So, I don't buy that side of the story. And there is a better way. I think, like Mussolini's fascism, for instance, and we can talk more about that later. But I guess, Frank, my point is that we've got to look first at the problems in the United States, diagnose those problems, what happened historically here and philosophically here that got us in this jam in the first place. And we also have to think about human dignity. This cannot be race-based. We're not going to go after Jews for the sake of going after Jews, but we also need to have an awareness that they can be problematic. So, for instance, we can't say it's all Jews. On the other hand, we can't ignore facts. The World Jewish Congress exists. It's been very influential throughout history. Israel exists. It's got its tentacles all over the United States. So we have to be realists, but we also have to remember God and human dignity. And so, again, this can't be some kind of like philosophy based on race, because that goes nowhere. That leads to perpetual conflict, and honestly, we know that the IDF itself, the Jews themselves, Israel themselves, they have a pecking order, a racial hierarchy. They themselves are racists in this regard to a certain degree. The Ashkenazi are on top, the Sephardic Jews are second, below them are the Arab Jews, and then after that the black Jews. And they treat them accordingly. So, Frank, where do we start? Like with American history, and the founding of this country, what are the primary things that went wrong?
Where did it go wrong? Well, it went wrong at the fall of man, at the very beginning, with Adam and Eve. But and through that, we've had sort of ebbs and flows to our human history and dealing with our fallen nature. And dealing with our fallen nature is very difficult without the sacraments and the life of the church that it bred throughout history. And the reason why, the West became the greatest civilization ever known to mankind is precisely because of Christendom. And we can debate where things went wrong in Christendom. We could point to the Protestant revolt as one, but the Enlightenment is the other. And it's funny because I just heard a diatribe from Glenn Beck going off on Alexander Dugin. I mean, this guy has a sickly fascination with Alexander Dugin and how Dugin has mentioned the problems that the Enlightenment brought to society and really to the West and as one of the byproducts of the fall. But of course, for Glenn, who's enamored in, again, Enlightenment principles, he finds that an anathema of sorts. But, we begin when man basically rejected God, rejected Christendom, rejected the church, rejected the sacraments. You can't go 14, 15, 1600 years on one trajectory with sort of the moral foundations put in place and then just cut that off and begin all over again with humanistic principles. I think that's where we could point to, right off the bat. And it's been a struggle ever since. The fact is that mankind has lost his marbles over the past 250 years, going back to the American and the French Revolution. And granted, the American Revolution was a little different than the French Revolution, but still, it's kind of, you could point toward that. And from there, these liberal principles begin to dominate the West. Liberal principles that contradicted 2,000 years, or at least up to that point, about 1,700 years of the analogy of the faith, what Christendom had built up. These men of the Enlightenment that rejected God, most of them, or took a very indifferent approach toward God, which I would argue is a rejection of God as well, too, right? And we began to tear down the structures of Christendom and began to elevate mankind and human individualism and man himself over God. I mean, that's just in a nutshell where I believe it goes wrong. But in the case of American society, it really hasn't been the same since the founding, as the nation really begins to, unravel pretty early on. And by the time we get to the Civil War, we have a lot of problems, and the centralization of power, of course, through a unification in what we call the Civil War. I would call it a unification of centralized powers. And eventually from there, after the war, we begin to get into the progressive era of American politics with Woodrow Wilson and FDR. And here comes, again, liberal movements that begin to dominate and tear down social structures. You combine that with Protestantism and its doctrinal chaos, and you've left a nation in total turmoil in terms of culture and values and faith and religion. And once homogenous communities begin to be split on those essential principles, then it's only a matter of time until your society starts breaking down. Now, again, I'm speaking in broad historical terms here, but I'm giving to you where and how it's broken down. And if you look at just, America's embrace of liberalism, particularly since the World War II era, and where America became the global leader of the world, the global hegemon of the world, you see things deteriorate even more and more and more because America never had that moral foundation. And, it's like I say, for, 1700 years, it is the church that determines, morality in individual nations and individual communities. And yet in America, we do something radically different. We give morality over to, lawyers in black robes, ironically enough, as if they have some jurisdictional authority to determine what morality is. And you wonder why the entire moral compass of the West has collapsed. Because why? We removed the church, we beat down Christendom in favor of humanism and liberalism, and now man basically gets to elevate himself based upon his innate instincts and his disorders, and elevates what were once considered vices into virtue. So, just to sum it all up nice and quickly, where did it go wrong? The embracement of liberalism.
You nailed it, and very few people realize that the founders were looking at philosophers, Enlightenment philosophers, when they were beginning to create the documents for this country. So life, liberty, and the pursuit of land and or happiness, depending on which one you were going with, Jefferson is going right back to John Locke. And so it's important to understand John Locke's philosophy, and it's important to understand where he pulled his ideas. So that essentially starts with Hobbes. And Hobbes is the philosopher that gives us this idea of the state of nature and radical individualism. And essentially this idea that man in this rugged state of nature is just trying to survive and can't really do it by himself. Somehow this brings about the social contract, and for men to cooperate essentially, but it's all based on just pure survival. Very Darwinian before Darwin ever showed up, right? In terms of scientific thought. There's a problem with this. It discounts natural law as a foundational understanding of man's being and what he is made for. And so these are two radically different worldviews. So you go from Aquinas and going all the way back, to the Stoics and what formed over time, like with the Greeks, and this idea of natural law. We can disprove this idea of radical individualism that the United States is based off of pretty quickly, because just through reason itself. You think about it and it's like, okay, did you create yourself? Oh, no, you didn't? Oh, it took two people to create you? Okay, so the idea of radical individualism is gone right there. We're at least starting with family. You didn't conceive yourself into existence. Hobbes has made a very terrible error. And then Locke comes along and tries to finagle that. He tries to overlay parts of natural law on top of this radical individualism, combined with this idea of natural rights. And he can never resolve that. He never resolves it. And so the founders created a document based on philosophy that was not even really finished. It was theoretical. And to top it all off, it really doesn't work. It's erroneous. So the political structure of America is based on bad philosophy. But not only that, it's based on a theology that's really kind of egalitarian. Protestantism itself. And, what are some examples of this going wrong early on, Frank, with the founding fathers? How their theologies even changed over time?
Well, Anthony, here's how I'll answer your question. I go back to Timothy Gordon, who argues that America was founded as a crypto-Catholic republic, that the governmental structure of the three branches of government comes directly from the Magna Carta. The emphasis, of course, is on subsidiarity. The states were supposed to pretty much govern themselves with sort of a weak federation government at the very top. And of course, as we've gone through, time, and the more consolidation of power has taken place, and not just in America, throughout all of the world, in terms of, what the Enlightenment brought. And that was the idea of the nation state. That's what the French Revolution was, right? It brought the idea of the nation state and he began to kill off subsidiarity. Eventually, those ideas would leak into the American ideas of governance, and America too, like every other nation in the 19th century, began to unify and consolidate power more centrally. So you got that there. But when we look at, things of, what Gordon presents, America's a crypto-Catholic republic, that's a hard sell for me. What I will give him is the fact that, again, coming off the heels of the Protestant revolt and all these Protestants who at one time were Catholics at one time, yeah, they took a lot of Catholic ideas. Why? Because Christendom was a dominant ideological or philosophical and religious principle of the West. It was built off of that. So when you get a schism and a rebellion, what are you looking back on? Protestantism wasn't there. So you're going to take Catholic ideas, and they took the ideas of subsidiarity and things of that nature, limited government, and certain, natural rights that they got from the Catholic world. We would call them, the natural law in many respects. Who was there to ever declare the revolution over, especially when every individual is their own God in a society of extreme individual rights? And we see this playing out every day in American society, and have been seeing this play out in American society now for the past 200 years. Sure, the country might have been a little bit more stable when you had old-line Protestant churches in place right before the Civil War. I would grant you that. But how long would it have been? Because those old Protestant churches, old-line Protestant churches, they're all gone now.
For our Protestant listeners, that are maybe a part of some of these groups, we're trying to make a cogent point here in terms of how philosophy and theology are upstream of political structure and why our political structure has failed. So the way that the founders constructed governance off of the flawed philosophical ideas of Locke and Hobbes is important to understand, because that flawed philosophy allowed for the very continued breakdown of Protestantism, from high Protestantism to Anabaptist to schism to schism to schism to schism. There's individuals and groups that will argue that abortion is a part of their natural rights. You can't really layer natural rights on top of natural law, because it leads to ambiguity like this. There could be an argument for that based on your theological perspective. And this is just where they got it so wrong. I mean, immediately, Frank, we see, just objectively speaking, I guess, what are some of the major violations of natural law that the United States has kind of engaged in? How is it that if young men are not ready to give up their Protestantism, what are some things they can do to at least be like, okay, these guys are right as far as natural law goes. We need to really have a structure in mind for how we're going to go forward and what that means for amending certain parts of the Constitution in order to avoid this travesty that just is on a repeat cycle.
Well, I think the one violation of natural law, which I think is most obvious, is not acknowledging the one true triune God that was handed down, for at that time 1,800 years of sacred tradition, where we look at God very abstractly and very individualistically for every individual's own personal flavor, and then we don't, for example, cut out all the blasphemies, right, under the guise of freedom of speech. Where under guise of freedom of speech, blasphemy is accepted as something of the norm and acceptable. And it's like I've said before, if you are a religious people and a religious nation and you truly honor God, you have to act like you honor God. And I think blasphemy laws is one of the great violations of that. And also too, things like slander and calumny and detraction. These are all sins that, sins of the tongue, as Anthony, you've talked about so many times, and yet there is no condemnation of this as well too, because it inherently goes back to the issue of freedom and liberty and what we have a right to do as individuals over that, even above the rights of God. Though that's the one that comes off the top of my head. Also too, Anthony, I can't excuse Freemasonry at the origins of the American founding and the confusions that Freemasonry kind of brings into it, and possibly some of the diabolical elements of that particular ideology. Some people would say it's a religion. Some people say it's just a men's social club, but its approach toward religion as well is interesting because it takes an even more indifferent approach toward religion in and of itself, where it embraces not just all the various Protestant sects, but any religion has the option to put their, holy scriptures, their holy books on the altar of Freemasonry. That creates an even bigger disunity within society and culture and politics.
I believe bringing up Freemasonry is an important point here because they talk about the great architect, right? And this is clearly a cult based. And so I think you connecting the fact that natural law is violated in some sense by not invoking the triune God in the Constitution, and perhaps what we've got is this abstract Freemasonic God related to the occult. I think it's a fair argument because at this point in history, even among Protestants, divine law has been fully revealed. Okay? So since divine law has been revealed, and we have certain ideas as a Christian nation at that time, at least culturally speaking, that the true God is triune and we know what his personhood is, then you could argue that could be incorporated into natural law itself, because it was one of those things in natural law that we had to reason out. A lot of natural law is on your heart. Some of the things you have to reason out. The triune God itself and the idea of the Trinity was reasoned out for many centuries post-resurrection. So I think it's applicable. And then, of course, we have all of the other instances and violations in modernity. Look at abortion, quote-unquote gay marriage, this idea of transitioning, which, by the way, goes back to Locke, too, because you can't, Locke had this idea of kind of radical uncertainty, where, for instance, if, I go to the refrigerator and I were to pour a glass of orange juice, and I left it sitting out on the countertop and I left, that somebody else might come in and see it and they would just be like, I can't be certain that a human being poured this orange juice into the cup because I didn't see it, right? Or a chicken laid an egg out in the barn. We know the chicken laid the egg, but we didn't see it happen, so we can't be certain that the chicken actually laid that egg. So it just... The philosophy that this nation was founded on is totally mind-warping. So, Frank, within the context of the First Amendment and pluralism, can you explain to the audience what pluralism means? You could explain that And what is the problem with that? What is it? What is absolute pluralism, and what is the problem with it that we face? And how do we rectify this with natural law?
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant by that. Is that I guess I was watching, in regards to the triune God, I guess I was watching a debate between Sam Shimon and some Mormons. And what you have is a purposeful denial ever since the Enlightenment. Again, let's remember, Mormonism, for example, is clearly an American religion founded off, the heels of American religious liberty, and it denies the Trinity, right? We have, almost 2,000 years of history, 1,900 years roughly, of the idea that the God is a triune God, and yet the Mormons deny this, right? It's an obvious fact in history. They even use or borrow from the book of the traditional Christians that have always taught the idea of triune God, and they try to rewrite the theology, right? This is what I mean by that. Does that fall under the elements of natural law? I'm not a great philosopher, I'd be the first to tell you, but that was my point there. Now, in terms of ultimate pluralism, and I think this is where we get into some areas in terms of what's happening today, as we have mass immigration coming in, and listen, mass immigration is not new. Obviously, we had immigration in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a nation that was formulated again by Protestants, Freemasons. They need the labor to help again consolidate the position here in the new land and do all the dirty work and all the dirty jobs, and hence we get the Catholic immigration of that period in time. The Italians, the Germans, the Polish, the Irish that come in here and start doing all the dirty jobs, let's put it that way, to help build the infrastructure of the nation. And so it's already pluralizing to a certain effect. Now we have Catholics coming in, mixing in with Protestants, but with the Catholics and the Protestants, it's interesting because Protestantism is an offshoot of the Catholic world, that Christendom, things of that nature. They're white, they're European in nature, and there's a lot of common values. I will say that. But once we get into the mixing of a third world nation kind of immigrants that don't share our Christian values and ethnically are just different than us, this is where pluralism ultimately becomes a big problem, because we have confliction now in terms of culture, values, morality, religion, and this is where the real damage is done to American society, and it feeds fuel to the fire, right? We already have, this Protestant anarchy, doctrinal anarchy that's already confusing the nation, and then you add the pluralism in, and it just feeds the confusion even more. And now this is why we've reached the point where a lot of people believe that the white race, the white European Christian race, is being exterminated by, again, political forces using immigration as a way to basically destroy what? Rome, right? Because the history of the West is Rome, right? Even the Protestants that broke away, their ancestry dates back to Rome, and it's a hatred for Rome, everything that it represented, especially the Catholic faith. And pluralism ultimately creates a contradiction of values, of morals, and this is where we get into deep cultural problems in America, and why we can't tend to agree on the basic notions, right? This is why, again, natural law, sodomy, right? It's being accepted as pluralism has broken down the values of society, when we know that goes against the natural law, right? So, yeah, pluralism has been destructive. It's brought divisions, it's brought schisms, it's brought confusion, it's brought anarchy to the West. You look around you today, the West is on the verge of collapse. And, all these different factors we're bringing up have contributed to that.
Exactly. And I would say, just for starters, anybody that's immigrated to the United States in the last 10 years illegally or underneath the H1, well, first of all illegals, you need to go, not just the ones in the last 10 years, but the birthright citizenship has to stop. All the illegals have to go. H1Bs need to go. They all just need to go. 10 years would just be a starting block. Yes, absolute pluralism is this idea that, like you're pointing out, we can have all of these religions and they're all somehow going to work together. All of these different ethnicities and they're somehow going to work together. Ethnicity wouldn't necessarily be as big of a problem if religion wasn't the problem. So Islam is just not compatible with natural law. It's possible some branches of it are. I'll give that caveat, but they would be tiny, like insignificant branches of Islam if they do exist. Indian paganism, no. For the most part, no. Not going to work out. Some of it might. But again, the numbers of these people we're letting in, it's unreal. It's going to totally balkanize and destroy this country. And so what we need to do is we need to amend the First Amendment. We need to get rid of this idea of absolute freedom to religion. If you're a Satanist, you don't have an absolute right to religion. If you're a pagan, you don't have an absolute right to religion. There might be some versions of paganism that would work because they would not violate natural law. But on the whole, it all needs to line up with natural law, and that's how this has to happen. Otherwise, we're just going to keep going down the same road we've been going down, and there's no fixing this. If we base it entirely off of ethnicity, rather than some kind of firm philosophical and theological structure, then that in itself can become a problem. Like you could end up, this is the problem with, I think, the racial supremacist side with neo-Nazism compared to, I think, what you would be amicable to, Frank, which would be kind of Italian fascism. First of all, why do you think that a race-based kind of solution is not necessarily the best way to go?
I think while we like being or living our lives, conducting our lives around people that are like us in terms of ethnicity and race and culture and things of that nature, race in and of itself doesn't foster the moral order. And listen, you could look around this country today and I'm going to be honest with you, man, there's a lot of white people I don't want to associate with. They are completely broken, okay? And, I'm not trying to rag on people that have hit financial hard times, but go to a trailer park, somewhere in the Midwest in America, and these people are completely disordered. And they're not disordered because they're white. They're not disordered because, they're necessarily bad people even. They're disordered because the faith has broken down. Ask yourself this question. What is the world better today under these secular principles of liberalism, or was it more well ordered under Christendom, where we had, strong cultures, strong familial bonds, good morality, right? In the old world, we weren't aborting children. We weren't contracepting women sterile. We weren't, emasculating men. It was a different society that had principles that first and foremost looked up at God, and it's what it made it very well ordered. Not that it was a perfect world. Again, I said that at the start of this because we have a fallen nature. But look what's happened as we have regressed, right? Or as we have dropped the faith, as we have apostatized as a civilization. Are we better off? Are we? Because all these things are coming down the pipe without the moral law in place. Race is not going to fix the moral dysfunctions of society. It just isn't. Now, some people are going to say, well, if we get, a certain group of people out that have brought in certain moral disorders, yeah, that's part of the problem there. And yeah, but at this point, right, people are so morally broken, regardless of where these moral disorders came from, right? They're so broken now, we have to reestablish this thing. And it can only be reestablished through faith in the one true triune God, the church, and the sacraments. Race in itself is not going to fix the moral dysfunctions of society. We may be able to coalesce around people that look like us and think like us and share the same values. There's something there. Don't get me wrong. Especially if we block those, pagan elements, or like you say, the Muslim and the Hindus and all those pagan religions over there. I get that. That's going to help. It's going to help. But the moral law has to be in place because humans human beings at this point are more broken than ever been before, because liberalism has just run roughshod, again, through the moral fabric of society. And, just to further emphasize the point, you asked me about, Italian fascism. What we have to remember about fascism is that it swept through the Latin Catholic nations. It was a way for them to try and cope with liberalism. Guess what? Surprise, surprise. All the problems we have in modernity today and a collapsing, Protestant Masonic civilization, the Catholics saw this coming down the pipe. And the church called it out. We have condemnations of all the popes against liberalism. We all saw it coming down the pipe. Everybody did in slow motion, right? But because Protestants are very individualistic, they don't necessarily have a church that ties back, that has lived and been a witness to the testimony of history. They have no knowledge of these issues. They couldn't see this thing coming down the pipe when everybody is in their own individual pope in their own moment of time, right? But as Catholics, we have a pedigree. We've lived through every civilization in history of the world. We are witness to every form of government and moral system and culture, society that the world has ever seen. And there's a wisdom that comes with the Catholic faith. And this was foretold. And the reaction by the time we get to the 1920s and 30s was fascism. Now, this is very convoluted, right? And I don't want to be too long-winded here. But, we've had the Enlightenment that hits at the end of the 18th century. And then for all of the 19th century, we have Marxism and sweeping through the European continent, leading to really a breaking point in the first half of the 20th century. What was the response by Catholic nations? It was fascism, right? Because they were being pushed by Marxism. And so, again, long story here, but the thing with fascism is this, right? And it's a major difference between communism and fascism. It respected the natural law and it respected the church. Look, all the fascist leaders, whether you like them or not, with the exception of the guy over in Germany, they were Catholic leaders. Franco was Catholic. In Spain, Salazar in Portugal was Catholic. Dolphus, before he was assassinated by that guy in Germany, was a devout Catholic. And Mussolini, toward the end of his life, converted to the Catholic faith. These were Catholic nations looking at, again, Marxism of the East, which was encroaching on them, and liberalism of the West. I'm talking about the kind of Wild West liberalism of the times of the robber barons that brought a whole other set of problems. Fascism came in and said, wait a minute, the Marxists are destroying the natural law. The Anglo-Protestant liberals are taking an indifferent approach, which eventually destroys the faith anyways. And here we are as fascists, But true conversions, especially in Italy with Mussolini, who again, toward the end of his life, found his Catholic faith, he implemented real measures in Italy that incorporated the church. Let's not kid ourselves. I know classical liberals are going to say that, well, he just used religion to substantiate his power. Okay, fine. You could hold that position, but he didn't have to give the church the power that he gave the church. He gave them the institution of marriage. He gave them the schools and the orphanages. The moral law was dictated by the church. He gave the church everything they wanted in terms of the moral law in Italy. I can only dream of a Western liberal leader ever doing that in today's society, right? Where we take, again, this indifferent approach that simply destroys the faith only a lot slower than the Marxists did. I've shot history here. I'm going through it real quick. But fascism is the one ideology of the 20th century that actually respected the natural law. Marxism didn't do it, and the Anglo-liberal republics didn't do it.
Yeah, I think there's a more nuanced view of Hitler that is emerging, that's been emerging the last 3 years, I would say. But really the research goes back much further with David Irving and people like that, where the church certainly had its problems with Hitler. However, it doesn't seem that he was necessarily moving towards paganism. It looks like he was trying to stomp some of that out. And Hitler was a fanboy of Mussolini. And the philosophy that Mussolini and other fascist philosophers codified did exactly what you're talking about. They put the church in charge in terms of the moral law. And so the state was not worshipped. Mussolini was not worshipped. He was a prime minister. In many ways, he was a servant. I think there was more of an emphasis on racial supremacy with Hitler. I do believe that for certain, based on the documents that we've read about his interactions with Mussolini and elsewhere. I think that combined with the elements of fascism that really built up an almost worship of the state ended up putting Hitler in a different type of category. And ultimately, and I think this is what everybody has to remember. Like, I get it if you admire his fight against the communists. I get it, believe me. But ultimately, he lost. And we have to reason out why he lost. He probably was a megalomaniac. I mean, the fact that he assassinated Dollfuss and that Mussolini was kind of terrified of the guy, I think shows some attributes that were not the best in the world as well. And so we need more of a pragmatic fascist approach, a more balanced approach, something that understands natural law and divine law. Because in this country, and Frank, correct me if I'm wrong here, maybe you have thoughts on this, but when you have, even among Christians in this country, theologically speaking, we have some disagreements, and also among the Christians in this country, theologically speaking, there are supporters of some of them are supporters of things that go against natural law. When you have that kind of disorder layered on top of a racial supremacist ideology devoid of God, I think that just spells like imminent danger. That to me is like one of the most Jewish things ever, because we don't want to become our enemies. Much as I, have serious concerns about Muslims and I don't trust them, it's not right to commit a genocide against them.
Yeah, those are great points. The thing with fascism is that it worked with the Catholic world because it was willing to, again, allow the church its place in society, and it respected the natural law. It wasn't a Catholic idea per se, but the Catholic world was willing to work with fascism because it could work with fascism, okay? Because fascism was willing to be very malleable in terms of governance. Was it authoritarian? Yes, absolutely. But when it came to the moral law and the natural law, again, it gave that power to the church. And I'll give you an example here. For example, many Catholics don't like Mussolini, for example, because he has a history of adultery and his conversion to the Catholic faith was late. Many of them don't even know that he converted to the Catholic faith because it's nothing that's been highlighted. What many Catholics gravitate toward is Franco over in Spain. Why? Because Franco was a devout Catholic. He supported the church. He brought the church in, and in that respect, Franco gets a lot of credit because of his Catholic faith. But the point is that the Catholic nations and fascism could work together. Did they butt heads at times? Like we get in the encyclical Non abbiamo bisogno? Sure, but even after that, the church and Mussolini worked it out.
The irony with a group like Patriot Front that is secular, but also has, I'm assuming, a lot of different types of Christians in it, they don't see that the kind of egalitarian theology and the problems that raises with a more authoritarian type state. It just, those two things don't mesh. I say Hitler wasn't Catholic, right? He wasn't a practicing Catholic. He fell away from the faith. He started to kind of turn Jesus into this kind of Aryan Superman. He never made a formal declaration that he wasn't Catholic anymore. I think in 41, like, he said he was still Catholic, right? But it was nominal. But in real terms, he was creating a religion that was like a racial religion. And although he did not like paganism, he still was, I would say, he was paganizing Jesus to a degree, because he hated the Catholics' concept of Jesus. I think he considered it Jewish, too Jewish. And so he believed that somehow the faith was malleable in that regard. I think, unfortunately, that was the downfall. It's a shame that that's where he ended up spiritually, because if he had fully embraced Mussolini's path, which was to go back fully to the church, I think he would have he would have been much more grounded, much more reasoned, much more in line with prudential judgments, and he would have made much better decisions that ultimately would have, between him, Mussolini, Franco, eventually, I believe, again, I think the Catholic world would not have only survived, but we would have defeated communism completely.
Oh, Patriot Front, here's the real irony is that what's the plan? What's the plan once you take over? Is it Constitution 2.0? Is it John Locke 2.0 and Founding Fathers 2.0? That thing pretty much fell apart by the Civil War. Let's be honest. And now we're living, ironically enough, in a nation that was founded off the principles of subsidiarity in one of the most intrusive, heavily taxed and regulated nations in the history of the world. The irony is this: what is the counterbalance to government? In the old world with the monarchs, it was the church. In the fascist world, it was the church. They were a counterbalance when government overstepped. What is a counterbalance in our society today? There isn't. The three branches of government can't protect because it's all government. It's all a giant club. Congress and our executive branch have proven over and over and over that they will collude together against the will of the people. The reason why you need the church is to be a moral counterbalance to the government. That's what it was in the fascist world, in the monarchs. And without that counterbalance, how do you govern morally? How do you protect the system? Who protects the people from the government? And applying the moral law to society. I mean, look at the joke the Supreme Court has become in our time alone, right? That determines all the morality of the nation and determines and really dictates policy and politics and everything like that. That's why it's more than just marching and giving a militaristic front. There has to be some real ideas on how to fix a lot of these problems, because it just seems like, a lot of these groups, they may have some good intentions. Again, I don't know who they are. I'm just going to assume the best of them, that they're patriotic and they care about the country and they see the dysfunction, the disorders of the nation like we all do at this point in history. But you got to have a real plan. It can't be just more of the same. It can't be Constitution, Founding Fathers 2.0. It didn't work the first time, and now we're in the midst of a civilizational collapse.
Right, and I think in terms of fascism, Hitler's view of Jesus is more Jewish than the Catholic view, and I'll explain why. When Hitler established this racial supremacist idea, and these neo-Nazi groups have now picked up on that, race has become their religion. This is why you see that in Ukraine, those neo-Nazi groups, what happened? They eventually let in the Jews. Why? Because the Jews are racial supremacists too. The Ashkenazis are at the top, the Sephardic are in the middle. The Sephardic and the Ashkenazi will mix, but then the Arabs are below them, and the black Jews are below them. And so this works great with the Indian caste system as well. So Patriot Front And these other groups of young men that are in these groups, they need to be acutely aware that they may accept a form of totalitarianism that they didn't anticipate accepting. And it could come back and bite them in the ass. The very people you think you're fighting against, you will embrace. So you have to be very careful about this. And at the very least, if you're not going to accept Catholicism at this point, or you need to look into it, maybe you're interested in investigating it now. At the very least, like you're saying, Frank, there has to be some kind of idea going forward. America 2.0 is not going to work. The Constitution is going to have to be amended. And we're going to have these men understand that natural law has got to be the centerpiece. At the very least, that has to be the thing that binds all of the Catholics and different Protestant groups together. We can acknowledge differences in ethnicity and maybe what that entails at a societal level and how we should run things based on that. But it cannot be with a supremacist attitude. It has to be with an attitude of looking at reality. The reality right now, I think, in America is that, ethnically speaking, what do we see that just plays out naturally? We tend to separate ourselves out, right? Different areas where we live, we have different cultural values and different behaviors, you know? There's nothing wrong with that. Forced integration was a real evil because I think it set us back more than anything else in this country, to be honest. I think that set us back more than anything else because just pure freedom of association would have worked so much better. Cultures do gradually get to know each other and mix on their own terms without government force. And so, and this is another way that liberalism has really hurt this country. So while I'm not a racist, I'm not a racial supremacist, I do acknowledge that there are differences, and there's nothing wrong with that because we're all made in the image and likeness of God. We all have human dignity. Understand the foundational philosophy of fascism, if that's the way they want to go. They need to look at what Mussolini did. They need to read about it extensively, and also not just the history, but also the philosophy and how he interacted with the church. Think about that as your 2.0, whatever the next system is going to be, and make sure that natural law is the foundation.
My final thoughts, Anthony, first of all, thank you for having me, is that, listen, I understand the plight of these young men. The world that we live in has been turned upside down, and not just politically and financially, but morally. And that's the greatest distress of all right now, because through the, moral collapse of society, it just brings a lot of problems to not only just culture, society, but to the individual as well. And a lot of these young men are confused in the globalist world that has crushed not only opportunity, but just the beauty, the natural flow of life, where life was a lot simpler. And, kids are being robbed of their youth. We're not playing outside anymore because of our technology and because we fear our kids playing outside, not only just from the boogeyman that could grab them, but even more so the influence of other people and cultures because of, again, as we've talked about tonight, the pluralism problem of all the different creeds and races and the disorders that are brought upon by people that are just different in a society that's lost all its hegemony. I understand these young men are frustrated and they're angry. I wouldn't say that the fluidity ladder in America is gone, but I will say that it's a lot shorter than it's ever been in its history. America as a nation, one of the things I give it credit for, it has been the land of opportunity. And now that one thing that it was great for is being crushed and destroyed. And you have a lot of young men. They can't find wives because feminism has destroyed women, has ruined women. They can't have families. They can't buy homes to raise their families. The job markets are tough. And simply surviving through an era of inflation and moral depravity and political chaos has really demoralized a lot of these young men. I think we're reaching a breaking point where you're going to see more of these types of movements. And like you, I hope they're well ordered. I hope they have leadership where they have faithful Christians, especially Catholics, that lead the charge here, because I believe that's the only hope. The West was built by the Catholic Church. It was built under the tenets of Christendom, and only by returning to those tenets again shall the West be saved. Apart from that, we're in a lot of trouble. Thank you, my friend.